Is the dean in?
Yes, I am.
Oh, yes, yeah, okay, all right. We will start at 8 as we normally do. And my excuses, I will be fumbling because I'm doing something that I've never done before. So Jason, when you're ready? No, sorry. What I want you to do for me. Welcome and good evening to another in the series of conversations. Actually, today marks the second phase because we started in July 2020. So we're now into July 2021. So this is the second phase of our conversations. The church in Barbados took part in the economic activity of slavery. In 1998, we named 10 national heroes, including Sarah Ann Gill. In 1999, the Anglican Bishop of Barbados, Rufus Broom, at a special seated meeting of Synod, apologized for the involvement of the Anglican Church in slavery. And I will read the resolution that was tabled on that day. Whereas the Anglican Church in Barbados has from its inception has an integral part in the life of the nation and accorded a privileged position as the established church in the land. And whereas in reflecting upon our history, we recognize not only the church's contribution to the national development, but also the failure to condemn the institution of slavery and the injustices experienced by the poor and the marginalized. Be it resolved that this synod, meeting to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the diocese, look at our history both with gratitude and our achievements and with an acknowledgement of our failures. And be it further resolved that this synod urges everyone, every member of the local Anglican community and all people of goodwill to fight against all forms of injustice and oppression and to work together for the establishment of a just and equitable society, where all members are treated as persons made in the image and likeness of God. That was moved by, at the time, the very Dean Harold Critchlow, and seconded by the Reverend Wayne Isaacs. So that is the background to part of what we will be discussing this evening. I will now ask Reverend Dr. Sonia Hines to lead us in the opening prayer. Tonight, we are discussing the topic, the church, reparatory justice, and the healing process. And before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to inform everyone of our housekeeping. Usually we are joined by the fourth estate, the media, the local media. So things that are said can be recorded and reproduced. So I would ask that persons be mindful of what they're saying. Also, at the question time, you can enter your questions, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. Said we are having 4 speakers this evening, and after their presentations, we will have a question and answer session. In terms of our presenters, I will speak to a short bio on the presenters in order of their presentation. We would be having the very Reverend Dean Shelley Ann Tenier, Trinidad. We also have Major Alfred Taylor, Joy Workman, and the Reverend Charles Morris. So as I said, the very Reverend Dr. Shelley Ann Tenier, she is the Dean of the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity in Trinidad and Tobago. She is the first female dean in the diocese, and I must say she readily accepted my invitation to be part of this discussion this evening. Major Alfred Taylor, I have known, I'll say, the Major for a number of years. As we know, or for those who do not know, he is married to Reverend Kim, but I'd known him before that because of his musical activities. But I was drawn more to him quite recently when he made a presentation to his assessors at KFIL, where he's an MPhil student, and he did a presentation on Black Church, White Church, or is it White Church, Black Church, which had us all who were able to watch that presentation and then have him involved in answering the questioning from his assessors. And after seeing that presentation, I called Alfred and told him what we were doing, because at the time we had not settled on a panel, and he quite readily agreed to be part of this panel. The third person who is on our panel is Joy Workman. Actually, Joy is someone I have known for some time, but I was pointed in her direction because I did not know of all her capabilities, because as far as I was aware, Joy was a person involved in fashion. And I also knew she was a Pan-Africanist, and that is the bit that I knew about her. But let me just speak to part of her bio that she would have presented to us. She says, a fashion designer by profession. As a citizen, I'm concerned and conscientious with a developed strong ideology of do good and justice for all, grounded in the ideological teachings of Pan-Africanism and feminist philosophies. And last but no means least is the Reverend Charles Morris, who most of you will know, but Charles now has been asked to serve as our Deputy High Commissioner to London. But before taking up that office,
good evening.
Charles has been a teacher for a number of years at the Commerce School, as some say, the University of Waterford, and he's been an examiner in history for a number of years. And Charles also was very happy when I called him and told him of this presentation, and he readily agreed. And he reminded me today that it is not 8 o'clock in Barbados, but it's midnight or past midnight in London. So he's actually given up some sleeping time to be here with us. And Charles, I'm very appreciative of that. So we now go into the presentations, and the first presenter is the very Reverend Dr. Shelley Antonio, the Dean of the Cathedral Church of Trinidad and Tobago, the Holy Trinity Church.
Good evening, everyone. And I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the other presenters and the organizer of this conversation, and all those who are listening. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you, and for Mr. Brown, who will moderate this evening. Again, thank you, and good night to everyone. And I also bring you greetings from the community here in Trinidad and Tobago. As I share for the next couple of minutes, I want us to hear that I'm coming from a place where I understand and acknowledge two things. One, that the relationship of the church and systems and practices of dominance and supremacy has been long and complicated. Starting from the Edict of Milan in 313, where Constantine made Christianity legal, to 380, when Theodosius made Christianity the state religion, the Roman religion, where as the official religion of the empire, it becomes a political tool, a source of social mobility, a means to get access to resources and services, an agent of socialization into the dominant culture. So I say that and I state it because I think it is underneath all that we talk about as it relates to church and the church's role, impact, and participation, and so its role in the process of repair and healing. So that's one. The second is that based on that justice in that context and in everything that followed thereafter, but starting there, justice was largely based on the divine right of emperors, largely retributive, relying on structural violence, especially towards slaves, persons of lower classes, conquered people. It thrived on inequality between social groups, highly stratified, highly patriarchal, preference to power, so that things may have been legal, but they may not have been just, because justice was not framed up in the ways that we may define justice, or as Christianity understands justice in the context of the life of Christ and what he sought to do, be, and what the church was intended to do and be as followers of the way. So I say those two things, understanding that informs in many ways what we've experienced, what happened over the centuries, and so must then inform how we go about the business, and speaking about the business of repair, the business of justice, and the healing process. It's long, it's complicated, and it's deep. So in my view, as it relates to the church's role, I firmly believe that the church has a role in terms of leadership by virtue of the way it came into exercising and participating in systems of injustice, and having participated directly and intimately in those systems, it now has a leadership role in leading us out of that and into an alternative reality. And how do I see that possible? I see it as an act. That's the acronym that I came up with. That leading in the things of accountability and advocacy, consciousness raising and conversion, transformation and truth telling. That is, in my view, the church's role and work if we intend for reparatory justice to emerge and for the healing process to be real, tangible, and experienced in our lifetime. And so, in the first instance, if we go to the A's that we and I say act so that you understand. I will not deal with them in that order, right? So I want to deal first actually with the business of the consciousness raising. Because for me, the consciousness raising and the conversion is really about truth telling. It's about naming the evil with specificity wherever and however it happened and continues to happen. In the church, outside of the church, and in all of the areas where it pervades. And I think we learned that, and for me, from our brothers and sisters in the South African experience, as Bishop Tutu demanded that truth-telling happened, and that the ugly and the evil and the injustice be named, whoever committed it. It didn't matter, but it needed to be named, and it needed to be named with specificity, that we call it out, which includes the attitudes, the perceptions, the beliefs, and all of the activities that contribute to othering, because ultimately that's a large piece of what drives the injustice and all that happens. And so it impacts everyone, not just the perpetrators, not just those who use those methods, but also those who are victims of same. And so it requires not only the truth telling that is necessary, but the consciousness raising that comes out of truth telling, and the conversion that needs to come out of that. The next piece I want to talk about is the role and work of the church in the business of helping to redeem images of God and images. And I come, of course, from a Christian bent, right? So that's my bias. But understanding that part of what happened was that God gets used to justify this systemic and structural business of oppressing people. And that is used, the scriptures are used to support that. And so the church's work and role, as far as I'm concerned, as it does this work of consciousness raising and truth telling, is to do the work of transformation and the work of conversion that will redeem images of God, that will take that back from those who engage in othering and systems of oppression and supremacy, and transform theological frameworks to help with interpretation, meaning making, guiding self-understanding, as well as guiding and transforming the ways in which we relate as human beings. So how we see humanity, how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we relate, those things need to be transformed. They need to be converted. And of course, the work of the consciousness raising and the conversion is going to happen in that. But that work is essential. And it should not be dismissed, because the alternative is necessary. People need the alternative to be held up and to be spoken. It needs to be articulated and repeated continually. And that, I think, is part of the church's work. Thirdly, that we engage in accountability, and that goes right back to naming and truth-telling and all the rest. But in addition to those things, that we also hold accountable by engaging in the restorative practices so that people see the alternative, that we're not only just speaking it, but we are living it, and that we're holding folks accountable to that new standard, so that as part of that and as part of the work of transformation, that systems, laws, all of it gets transformed, and we are engaged in those conversations so that the alternative becomes the norm. And that includes changing social norms, changing cultural practices, changing attitudes, but it requires consistent accountability, because the system forces are strong. It has been ongoing for hundreds of years. So if we want it to be different, we can't do stuff now and then stop. But it also means that we have to challenge ourselves as church, because it is so ingrained, is that it has seeped into our life as church as well. So we have to do that work. And finally, the advocacy work that goes along with the accountability work. As people of privilege, and I speak specifically now as an Anglican Christian in a territory that was once British, and I believe this is true for Anglican churches everywhere, that we have received a certain amount of privilege because of how the church was used for the empire, and that our work, we can't do anything about that. It is what it is, but we have a responsibility to use the privilege that we now have and that has been given to us to be advocates, and advocates for the transformation that we want to see, allies for the alternative way, and to ensure that the resources needed for societal and systemic change and transformation in every discipline is gathered. Because the kind of change I'm talking about that is systemic and deep and will take a long time requires resources. Absolutely requires resources. And so that we advocate for those resources in the legal system, for education, in economics, for family life, for cultural appreciation, and all the other factors that inform the way we see ourselves, the way we interact, and the way we organize ourselves as society. And so I think the church has an extremely important role in that process, leading repentance, encouraging forgiveness, participating in the restitution and repair work, doing the rebuilding of trust, renegotiating the terms of the relationships, and engaging in the kind of renewal that is the true mark of reconciliation and healing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Shelley-Ann. We now move on to Major Alfred in terms to make your presentation.
Well, good evening to everyone present. This topic is a very engaging topic, a very exciting topic, it's very deep. And we hear the word reparations used a lot these days. And we will need to unpack that a little bit so that we understand clearly what we're talking about. Simply put, it means to make amends for a wrong. And the wrong done to our ancestors is obvious. The lingering effects of that wrong persist, but may not be that obvious until we take a closer look. Reparations could be monetary, some form of compensation, but the intent is to repair the consequences of the violations against humanity. But to do this, we need to understand the true nature of the issue. The facts are that the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was part and parcel of the domination and enslavement of our African ancestors. The open use of power, the abusive use of power was very much part of that process. And let's be clear about this. The church and state, the planters' church, were one and the same being. As one author puts it, no colonizing venture was complete without the pious minister. And in the early days of the management of plantation society, church and state were very much closely intertwined. And why were they here? Not seeking adventure out in the tropics. It was an economic venture. And the inputs to that economic machine were our African ancestors, here to be exploited and worked so that another set of people could enjoy the spoils and the profits. But what happened over time became even more interesting. In the early days, it is clear that the Church of England had no interest in the souls of our African ancestors, no interest in their humanity whatsoever. Now that persisted for a while, but then came a point where the moral imperative, globally pretty much, was that this thing was iniquitous. It was plain wrong and it could not be sustained. England itself was in an uproar over whether or not to pursue slavery and enslavement of other peoples. And so this idea of emancipation, the gradual, perhaps sudden freeing of the formerly enslaved people, was supposed to be a great transformative event. I argue that it had not quite the desired effect. In fact, I argue it had an effect that we are still suffering the consequences of today as a people, certainly as a church. And I'll tell you what I mean. with the guiding of the process of emancipation by the first bishop. And I don't believe it's any passing historical event that he was appointed in 1824, less than 10 years after the 1816 rebellion, which scared the living daylights out of the plantocracy. And I think this is interesting because when we look back at it critically, not from the perspective of the white history books, but when we look at it from our perspective, from the perspective of our African ancestors, we see that this process of emancipation transformed hard, physical, violent power into a more subtle, soft, insidious kind of power that rendered us even weaker than in the days when we were prepared to struggle. And how did they do this? Lesson number 2 in cultural studies is an introduction to the concept of hegemony. And those who like to read this kind of thing can look up Antonio Gramsci, who put the idea that power does not necessarily have to be brute force. Power can be so subtle that you can find yourself caught up in its process willingly. And that's the beauty of hegemony. And it is so persistent and so pervasive that I tell you, even today, in the 21st century, we are still under the hegemonic influence, especially, I must say, as members of the Anglican Church. Now, let me be clear. I am an Anglican, very much by choice. And even though if I wanted to change my mind right now, I don't think my wife would have it. But when I found it necessary to relocate myself back in the presence of God, and I shopped around, the only church that did not give me a headache, well, the only two, was the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church. And I found the Methodist a little too preachy. And I was very comfortable in the Anglican Church. But as I observed things, I realized that there was something not quite, I'll use the word authentic about it. As a African descended Barbadian, when I go into Anglican church space, I don't know that I always feel like I'm at home. It might feel to some like you're invading somebody else's space, because the rules of operation, the rules of conduct don't seem to reflect who I am as a person. The restrictions in movement, the restrictions in expression, the very clearly scripted way we do things doesn't always feel like I'm at home. Beyond this, though, what the process of emancipation did was to reinforce the distinctions in race and class in this very society. Bishop Coleridge, rather than facing the injustices of inequalities, etc., head on, and he had the power to do this. He seized power early o'clock, and he had the power to do this, but rather than insist on equalities among all human beings, proceeded to confirm, reaffirm distinctions in class and race. And evidence of this still persists, even today. Now, what we need to do is take a close look at what we do and how we do it, and indeed who we are. Sometimes I think we are so caught up with preserving a liturgical process that was given to us, that we are very, very unwilling to even attempt to change it in any meaningful way. Of course, we make our adaptations here and there, but by and large, we have inherited something which, by the way, was never meant to be some monumental process for all time. In fact, when you look at the history of the liturgy of the church, it was meant to be a simplified process of what previously existed. And somehow, because it was given to us, we can find to this very day in some of our churches, services conducted according to the 1662 rite, complete with the language, complete with God Save the Queen, etc., etc. And you have to wonder, what is it about us that makes us want to preserve this thing so faithfully? Do we understand what it does to us as a people? Do we understand that the process to liberation of ourselves is to look at what this does to us and directly challenge it, directly recreate our space or theology in a way that liberates us as a people? But back to the topic of reparations. How? How do we do this? Well, I'm going to break down reparations into 4 other R words that might help. The first thing that the mother church must acknowledge, and by and large they have with words, and what we as the inheritors of the mother church must accept and understand, is that there must be regret about how our ancestors were treated. Church must be genuinely understanding of the harm it has caused, continues to cause, and be genuinely sorry about this. The next R word is restore. We have to make amends. We have to honor the memory of our ancestors and acknowledge what was taken away from them. What Bishop Coleridge and succeeding bishops, I suspect, would have dismissed as heathenish superstitions was really the spirituality of a people as valid as any other. We have to allow the restoration of an authentic spirituality. The thing next R for me is to avoid repetition. The things that have brought us to where we are, that we continue to practice faithfully, we have to understand the effect of those things, and where possible, where necessary, have the courage to change them. And finally, we have to be able to seek a remedial practice. We have to work out ways of being, ways of doing things that liberate us from this process, from what I call in cultural studies the hegemonic discourse that persists. So those are things that we can do. Practically, this could mean, and if we're talking about reparations from the mother church, we are talking about contributions to education so that we understand the process better. We're talking about financial support or otherwise to places like Codrington College, the Erdisting Teachers Training College. We're talking about investments in technology and industry. We're talking about education in cultural studies, education in music, education in theology. These things can be easily afforded. These things are affordable. But the important thing about it is that these things help us to understand and address the wrongs. Finally, we have to be really honest about these things. The good Reverend Doctor said, all persons are made in the image of and likeness of God, and that all persons must mean all persons. So anything that looks like discrimination against anybody of any race, creed, class, color, gender, orientation, we must be prepared to deal honestly with. In closing, let me suggest what might sound a little radical, but what to me would signal to everybody that we're serious about being ourselves. Let us change our space. Let us change our liturgical space. Why on earth should we have these dull colors reflective of a European space? Why isn't the interior of my church colorful, bright, vibrant colors? Why do we have to maintain stained glass images with people that clearly are not our ancestors? Radically change them. Why not? The soundscape of Anglican church space. The organ is a wonderful machine, and in the right hands can really motivate a congregation to singing, but it is not the only way to do it. And we have to be prepared to explore a soundscape that is more like what we hear outside the church. Of course, with the appropriately tempered language. But if we're going to have a generation of young people coming to sustain the church, and I admit I am very much interested in sustaining the church, maybe not in its current form, but in a form that is reflective of who we are as a people, so that when youngsters come, they feel at home. When they engage in the liturgy, they feel like it can speak to them and not like they're pretending to be 500 years old and going through a liturgical process that would have been familiar to long dead people. This kind of radical change, even in the very vestments our clerics wear, why not? Why can't our church, that has such an important role to play in our restoration, in our stability as a nation, why can't it feel more like it belongs to us rather than our holding on to the planter's church? Lastly, the importance of this goes way beyond church space. If we are to be who we truly can be in terms of our economic activity, our academic activity, in terms of our creativity, all these things must be assessed from a position of confidence in who we are as a people. And especially in economic activity, in my reading, it stunned me to recognize that the process of emancipation literally set up one class of people to be managers and leaders and another class of people to be followers. That has got to change. We have to take charge of our space. We have to take charge of our theology. We have to take charge of our cultural practices that make no particular reference to anybody else's. We have been an independent, quote unquote, people for far long enough that we can have the confidence to be who we are. That mirror image of ourselves must be a comfortable one. And I will leave it there at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Alfred. And I now invite Joy Workman to make her presentation. You need to unmute, Joy.
Hi, good night. First of all, let me extend a warm thank you to the church and I would just jump right in, saying a nice hello to the fellow participants. And I feel like the rose among the thorns in terms of where my beliefs are and your beliefs are. But needless to say, I was invited and I will do my best. And I will just start by Michael had sent us some information and I pulled from it to start my presentation. And it basically stated he was looking at the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, stated that the church needs to put its house in order and acknowledge tangible or historical failures. At this virtual conference, Vice Chancellor Hilary Beckles of UE, one of the leading proponents of reparations, responding to Wellesley's statements by saying, not enough, not acceptable. Our noted poet laureate, Kamal Brafitt, he coined this poem years ago. And to me, it fit right into this whole question of reparatory justice. It is not enough to be paused, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semicolon, to be semicolony. Fling me the stone that will confound the void. Find me the rage, and I will raise the colony. Fill me with words, and I will blind your God. That is Kamal Brafitt poem in looking at the whole question of colonization and the absurdities that we went through. And to continue to this day, the Church of England have not made any concrete restitutions to descendants of those subjected to centuries of slaveries and discrimination. And as Shelley and everybody else and Alfred has spoken, to the atrocities that the church had signed on to. Beckles further stated that apologies based on repentance must transition into reparation and reparatory justice. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. And in speaking to this whole question of the whole healing process, I was listening to a call-in program, and the moderator of a popular call-in program was trying to highly influence his callers to the concept of crabs in a barrel to explain as a justifiable argument and explanation why Black business and wealth making is not occurring in Black world as he perceived it should be. His justification was void of any understanding of acknowledgement of economic and historical injustices, global capitalism, trade, and persistent hegemonic rule of imperialistic capitalism. He further justified and developed his crab in the barrel argument by relating a conversation he had with a local white man who received an unsecured loan from a friend to start his business. The moderator continued in his articulation confidently about the cooperation between white people and that is why they are successful, and Blacks are too caught up within the crab in the barrel mentality. His thinking, I suggest, is relatively popular. I suggest that the prevalence of this thinking and analysis are reflective in part of the framing of narratives. These narratives, I do believe, are at the intersection of various levels of assimilation of thought, deliberately created by a knowledge-making system and by institutions involved in power structures grounded in exploitation and subjugation to maintain and justify injustices. This thinking, Baldwin suggests, obscure more than it reveals. That is the crab in the barrel analysis. This persistent analysis of crabs in the barrel to explain, justify inequities and amongst the inequity and wealth amongst the races and the stage of development of people of the South obscure historical injustices of the distribution and exploitation of resources and persons. This persistent discriminatory practices of allocation of resources begets an understanding of what are the elements inherent in what is constantly referred to as the need for healing, and what is the church's role in this reparatory justice. I trying to understand the concept of healing I decided that, the breakdown of this word to give clarity and meaning became crucial in understanding what is the role of the church, the attitude of the church, the purpose of the church, and importantly, as identified in the briefing I received about the purpose of these conversations, is the need for the church to remain relevant in today's society. And my question is, and I do question because I don't have answers. I'm not big on church, but I do recognize that the church plays a part in people's lives, especially women's lives. So my question is, how do the church intervene in changing this narrative and to maintain its change the narrative of the crabs in the barrel, and in so doing maintaining its relevance in the 21st century and be an active participant in securing reparative justice. Here, I give meaning to the healing process to identify that the process of restoration of health, we have to restore the health of the people from an unbalanced disease that will cause damage and requires repairing to the harm caused. The search, so in looking at how the church can be involved in the reparatory justice process, the church as an institution, and specifically here, the Anglican Church, which was largely involved in framing of a narrative from its ugly history in which it established linkages with enslavement and subjugation, thus establishing relations of racialized knowledge. And this racialized knowledge is very much how we have assimilated thought, how we look for understandings of the inequities, but we do not see the larger picture that is the question of the maintenance of a narrative that entails a global trade system, hegemonic, imperialistic ways of being that is still very much tied up with power. And how does the church crack this knowledge narrative so that we as a people, like Aquino, way back in the 1770s, this is Aquino in the 1770s, trying to undermine the whole knowledge system that existed. Where is the church today in doing that reparatory justice? I am arguing, and I'm arguing because this is what I want to put there. Shelley spoke to it in a way where she talked about accountability and justice and so on. But I'm arguing about the church, but it's very silent at the moment. It's very much persistent involved in this whole question in maintaining the whole question of inequity and economic injustice in the people, the racialized way, and of people of the South. Now, one of the things that's happened, CARICOM has established a 10-point plan for the whole question of reparatory justice. And in doing that, CARICOM recognized not only the tangible ways that reparatory justice can happen through debt release, through education, through all of the 10-point plan, but within CARICOM, one of the number 8 in the 10-point plan looked at the whole question of the psychological ways in which reparatory justice can occur. And I'm arguing that the church is very much needed here as an institution. Regardless of how I feel about the church, it makes an important impact on people's life. One, when it comes to moral, the church is morals, sexuality, and so on. The church voice is very large. But when it comes to economic justice, inequities in society, the church is very silent. And I'm arguing that this is where reparatory justice and the healing process of the church can come hand in hand. The church needs to reframe, and I think Shelley spoke to it a bit, reframe the whole understanding of how inequities, injustice is persistent. Kevin Washington, a noted Black psychoanalyst in the States, is saying that there's a persistent traumatizing of people where economic inequities continue. And likewise, if the church does not raise its voice in terms of being persistent in denying and denouncing economic injustices and acting and being an active participant in reparatory justice, then by its silence, it becomes complicit as it was during slavery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. We now move into the final presentation. I invite Reverend Charles Morris to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen of the audience. In my case, it is good morning. In your case, it is good night. I would have liked to say good night to my friends and family from Black Best, but I understand that they have no electricity there. So maybe somebody can pass on the message to them. Mr. Moderator, I sit here, I'm listening to all the comments. And I'm trying to fathom and seriously fathom why we don't shut the Anglican Church and call it a day based on what I've heard tonight. The Dean called for truth. The question is, whose truth? Whose truth? And when it comes to truth, I always go back to the story of Jesus and Pilate, the same issue of truth. When Jesus was before Pilate, when Pilate asked him, are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of the Father? And Jesus said, you said so. And Pilate continued to question him. And then Pilate said, okay, Ben, let me paraphrase it. Let's go outside and see. And Pilate said, I offer to you Jesus, the Son of God, or the Son of the Father, or Barabbas. Okay? The word Barabbas means Bar, son of the Father. And John carefully scripted that to show how the same truth and the people quest for truth and whose truth can mislead people. The people said, give us Barabbas. In other words, give us the fake truth. Barabbas. It looks like the truth, but it is not the truth. And I have heard an attack on the Anglican Church, and I'm going to be very frank about this, because we need to get one or two things straight. I've heard an attack on the Anglican Church tonight, and I wonder why we keep these churches open. First of all, about changing up the services, and Christianity went to Africa long before it came to Europe. And by that time, the church had formed a kind of Christianity, a kind of liturgy, even before it came to Europe. And for those who believe that singing, jumping up and that kind of thing is African, let me remind you that that singing response is more African than it is European. I mean, even if you go to the South African anthem, the Sikelele Africa, you would hear one person sing and the others follow it. Okay? So don't let us be too concerned, because there must be order. And even the Africans themselves use order in their church. So let's deal with that at the moment. Then I come to the issue of the church and slavery. I have heard an attack on the Anglican Church over and over. Let me make one point clear. We must deal with this hypocrisy. One, because here's it, we are criticizing the Anglican Church, but yet we say nothing about our parliament. You know what we did with our parliament in 1989? We celebrated big 350 years of the establishment of a parliament in Barbados. It was a big celebration, and only for 50 of those 350 years were Black people allowed to go into the parliament. But I don't hear anybody talk about pull down parliament, but pull down the church. if you're going to deal with reparatory justice, we must not be hypocritical. One, the Anglican Church carried the brunt of criticism. It was not the only church, and let me quote from Eric Williams. You see, the important thing here is that an historian depends on evidence. And when we talk about reparatory justice, my question is if it is revenge or reparations. And I believe in reparations. Okay? There's a whole, I can talk the whole night on reparations. But let me make one point clear. I can, first of all, go to page 44 of Eric Williams's, it's 44, of Eric Williams's book, Capitalism and Slavery, in which Eric Williams said that the church, the layman of the day was also the church. And as a consequence, they had nothing to apologize for. And he went on at the end of, coming on to the end of the chapter, these were his words: the apology is unnecessary. The slave trade was the branch of trade and a very important branch. The church side was a branch of the slave trade and a very important branch. Now let's talk about apology, because we talk about revenge and reparation and repentance. The Anglican Church was one of the churches, yes, that was involved in slavery. We all know about the Anglican Church. But while others hid under the guise of protest, they were also part of the slave system. The Anglican Church was not the only church. And I got to sound like a teacher now. If you're going to talk about Gramsci, you're also going to talk about Alexis Tocqueville, who went the opposite direction. All right? When Methodists came to the Caribbean, it was brought by Nathaniel Gilbert. And Nathaniel Gilbert preached to his slaves from his doorstep. They couldn't even go in the house. All right? Then there was a rebellion going on. Methodist priests attacked the Anglican Church. Okay? And the same Methodists, and I make no apologies because these are facts of history. The same Methodist Church, led by a man called William Shrewsbury, who was accused of inciting the enslaved people. When the commission came to investigate, William Shrewsbury's words were, if the slaves think that what I was doing was in defense of them, it only goes to show the perversion of the African race. William Shrewsbury, okay? The issue of 1816 rebellion, come on. How could we talk about the church and only talk about the Anglican Church? When the Moravians in 1816 were jumping up and saying, thank God our slaves are not involved in the rebellion. Then there were a lot of other denominations, the missionaries and the Baptists and all of them, who were trying to enslave, who were telling the slaves, oh, be good slaves. One of these days, this is going to be over. And the planters at first were against the missionaries. But then, when they realized that the missionaries were telling the slaves to be quiet, the planters and the missionaries became friends. I was making a note as you all talk because I'm getting a kind of attack on the church. When slavery ended, in fact, let me say this. The way you all talk about, and people talk about Africans, you make it seem as though those Africans who were enslaved in the Caribbean, that they allowed slavery to define who they were. Slavery did not define who those slaves were. Slavery was something that happened to them, but the slaves never allowed themselves to be to be seen as slaves. That is why there was the rebellion. That is why, especially the women too, that is why it was there. Now, when it came to emancipation, what do we mean by reparative justice? What do you mean by reparation? I agree. Let me say I agree with the reparations, because the reparations that was paid at emancipation was only paid to the planters. When the planters in Caribbean were given 20 million pounds. That is a fact. But at the same time, then they continued to enslave the people for 4 further years, which I think Rebecca said was $27 million. Okay, so they had it 2 ways. So yes, there is a need for reparations. Not revenge, but reparations. What I am seeing coming out is revenge, because we are tearing down statues, we are tearing down this thing, we are getting rid of the next thing. And what is happening? When you destroy the evidence of history, tell me how our historians are going to write their history. They cannot destroy evidence. But let me tell you something. If we're going to talk about reparations and reconciliation, then we have to look at it in the church from a theological perspective. And one is role reversal. You cannot have reparations and repentance unless you have a role reversal. It is what happened in the Old Testament with Joseph and his brother, Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. Then by that time when they identified themselves, or when they identified Joseph, they understood then how it felt. The way Joseph treated them, they understood how it felt to sell a brother or to sell someone into slavery. Okay? It's the same thing with Esau and Jacob, who had the issue of the birthright. Jacob, don't forget, they forgive one another. But reparations must also, or reconciliation, repentance, must be more in action than words. And I agree with the last speaker. It must be more than action than words. What did the Anglican Church do? One of the things that the Anglican Church did was to start a whole education program by the building of schools. By the building of schools. And the Anglican Church built a lot of schools. And when other denominations saw what was happening, they too followed the Anglican Church. And you, all of us in here, know that the Anglican Church, that even now, there's some monies owed to the Anglican Church for the schools that they built that were no longer used. The problem here is that the priests were in the parishes as well. And this is where the church has been, because the church has moved away from the parish. And I'm going to get back to that later. Okay? I'm going to get back to that later. So they started education. There were a number of priests who formed characters of young persons. I mean, there were some who were destructive too. But who formed the characters of persons? Priests help persons to live this life. I am one that benefited from the priest, from a priest. So I am at a loss at times when we are talking about the church. Look at the church. Look at the amount of, even now, the amount of boards that church people sit on. Why? Because there is still a moral aspect of it. What our issue is, and let me say this, we have to look at the impact of slavery. Where were these people impacted? you must understand, we all must understand that, and I'm going to talk the Caribbean and Barbados in particular, that England became an industrialized society based on the contributions from slavery. There is no two ways about that. When we look at cities like London, like Liverpool, like Manchester, Birmingham, all of them benefited tremendously from this. So what do we need? We need one, as it said, the cancellation of debt. But you know, the problem is that we were granted independence, but we're still not free, because the same sources, the same forces that gave us this independence and gave us this freedom are still trying their utmost best to keep us enslaved, in slave conditions. So therefore, we had our economies, they never did anything for economies after emancipation or after independence. Therefore, I believe that these countries, one, should not only cancel debt, but they should also remove all the blacklisting that they're doing. Because when you blacklist us, you stop us from progressing. When you try to impose a corporation tax, an international corporation tax, you are even denying sovereign countries the right to tax. So that must go. Then what we're doing with the climate, what is happening in the Caribbean has nothing to do with anything in the Caribbean. It has to do with the impact of what the industrial world is doing. It has to do with that. A lot of Barbadians sit here and they back English teams, they back the football teams in particular. They back Manchester United and Manchester City, Chelsea and Liverpool. What about sports programs set up by these communities? This is real reparations now. This is not just talk. This is what we call reparation. Sports programs that help promote sports in the Caribbean and different sports as well. But you cannot tell me that, and I want to notice something, that there's always the element of racism. You know, early in the year, I heard Sterling complain about racial abuse. All right? I'm sure you all heard that, Rashford and all of them. But now, playing for England, they're hailed as heroes. You know why? Because that same plantation mentality is still there. We only love you in as much as we can benefit from you. So reparations is on. I heard the Prime Minister, and I'm going to say this now, because there are many deficiencies in the church. Don't talk about the singing, Alfred. Don't talk about the hymns. Don't talk about the liturgy, because the liturgy is rich. But talk about the current church and ask yourself, and ask all of us, if the church is really positioning ourselves for a takeoff. I close there because I'm going to come back later.
Okay, thank you, Charles. We're now open to questions. I see a comment or question from Dr. Derek Murray. If you actually have any other questions, you can actually place them in the chat, or if you can raise your hand, we will pick that up. This is a question to you, Reverend Charles, and this is from Dr. Derek Murray. He says, is Reverend Charles Morris saying that since other churches and institutions were involved in the horrors of slavery, then the Anglican Church should be ignored?
Well, I never said that, but if that comment is made, then it should be scrutinized with forensic exactitude. Because I am saying, and listen to my comments carefully, I said at the beginning that I sat here and I heard attacks on the Anglican Church. But you talk about the church, and the only church that was attacked tonight was the Anglican Church. I'm saying you attack all. But a lot of denominations hid under that, guys. Look, the Methodists owned slaves in Barbados, owned slaves in the Rainward, and were attacking slavery in Barbados. I am an Anglican. Do you want me to defend my church? I'm not saying that it was right. I'm saying that the comments that I heard tonight came on the Anglican Church. And it's not the only church. I would want to say to Dr. Derek Murray, however, that the hypocrisy exists when you have two churches at war. Religion was not under threat in Barbados, but you have two churches at war. And you took out one, even a slave owner, and made that slave owner a hero or heroine. Okay? And we feel satisfied. No, I'm not saying who should be or who should not be a hero. I am saying that we must be consistent in our arguments. And nobody from the Anglican Church, the Anglican Church did a lot for the Caribbean too. Don't let's fool ourselves.
Let me come back in here and reply to my teacher. You folks watching or viewing might not know this, Reverend Morris, but you taught me religious studies in fifth form. So if I appear a bit radical, you can guess where I got that from. No. The Anglican Church was not the only game in town. It was the biggest game in town by far and away, but not the only game in town. The Moravians came with an attitude that says, we're not going to interfere with slavery. In fact, we support it. We want the slaves to be good slaves. The Methodists were a little more sympathetic towards enslavement, but they were not permitted to interfere. The Quakers had a running battle with the Anglican Church. So the point is,
this book, the
point is that anybody who came up against the might of the Anglican, of the established church, felt its wrath. End of story.
The Quakers,
sorry, to finish. Nobody's attacking the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church doesn't need to be attacked. If you look at the statistics in the sense starting from the 60s and coming down to the current day, and you look at that slope, that curve, the church will naturally die a natural death unless it takes a close look at itself. Not an attack, but an examination, because it has to do something about itself if it's going to survive. By my calculations, it has another 20, 30, 40 years maximum on its current trajectory, unless it does something about itself. Now, I'm not talking about morals, I'm not talking about standards. These things are defined within cultural context anyhow. And if you're saying to me that something is only acceptable or something is only worth preserving if it was inherited from somewhere else, and we are incapable of developing our own sense of morality and our own sense of standards that are culturally appropriate to who we are, then I'm not quite sure that we're talking the same language. Okay, now,
sorry.
My last point on schooling. One of the chief contributors to what I call the persistent hegemonic discourse has been schooling, not education, but schooling. And we are still battling with that to this very day. That is also something that will have to change if Barbados is to become the industrial powerhouse, the source of creativity that it can be. This industrial age schooling process serves us well only so far, but leaves out a whole heap of people that can be the creative driving forces of our economy. So, you know, please don't feel that my examination of the Anglican Church is any kind of attack on it, because, like I said, it's going to bring itself to a natural conclusion unless we take a real close look at what we do, how we do it, and who we appeal to.
What you just said, Alfred, was also said in the 1st century, that is certain the church was going to die. It was said,
Okay.
it's not now, it was said in the 1st century as well. In fact, they called Paul a spermologos. Who are these fellas that come and turn the world upside down? They said that also.
Well,
so the church ain't going away.
The numbers will speak.
Okay. I can deal with the comment from Alfred with regard looking at the statistical, the numbers from the census, but I might also question if the numbers we had in the earlier days of persons belonging to the Anglican Church, was it because of the vestry system? And if you weren't baptized in Anglican, you wouldn't get a job. But that may be another comment for another time. But I would like to ask Alfred, because he linked two things together. He now spoke of in his view, unless we change, we would not have the Anglican Church in another 20 to 30 years. I don't think I'll be wrong at that time. But Alfred, you spoke of not feeling comfortable, the church not looking like you. So you're linking that the church not looking like you with the situation that if you do not change, we will not have an Anglican Church in another 20 or 30 years. I'm not sure if other persons or other panel want to speak to that, but can you expand a bit more on that, Alfred? Because I think that is very disconcerting, because I go to Holy Trinity and we speak of persons being welcomed and feeling comfortable when they come to church. And sorry, before I will take editorial power here and say that at least our stained glass window represents our community. So at least you've given us one tick. Yeah, if you can speak to the whole aspect of the church not looking like you, and we will be in another 20 or 30 years might not have a church if we do not change.
Absolutely. And this is a view that I hold pretty strongly. When we look at the current demographic of the church, largely female, largely 50 plus to 70, 80 odd. When you look at the numbers of younger people, very, very small numbers, very small percentage. I don't have my stats with me here, but very small percentage. And when you do the math, when those lovely old ladies that are the salt of the earth, those ones that attracted me to the Anglican Church, when they go, and their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children aren't in church, there will be no congregation. Where are you going to get it from if nobody's there now?
Alfred, your thing is not true at all. You're not being candid. Listen to me. Let me give you some things about the church, okay? About the Anglican Church. The young people, our society has become more and more secular. The Prime Minister some time ago said that we need more people, that the population is declining, or it should not be, it is not, the numbers are not there where they're supposed to be. That was the time for the Anglican Church to carry out its own study to show, to see, or to make an argument for the church itself. Then the decline of the Anglican Church, with the decline of religion, you find that there were fewer marriages. These are all the little things you got to start looking at. You cannot do these things without proper investigation, Okay, what happened? What is terms of family life? You know, there's an argument, and you can reach on one side. So this, he believes that where there's religion, there's strong families, there are more marriages, and the population increases. What has happened? I get there two things from teaching, as you know, sixth form history, Caribbean studies, and sociology. I've noticed this. One is that a number of our priests, and I have to be brutally frank with this, cannot interpret the scriptures for these young people. It is now not what happened, it is what do these things mean? And a number of our priests cannot interpret them. There are 4 persons in this church right now. You're talking about decrease. Let me tell you something. In 1978, 4 men got ordained. Fathers Williams, Darlington, George Harewood, and Curtis Goodrich. And the preacher at that service said, I was 18, it was the first ordination I went to. He said that the Anglican Church is at the crossroads, and you 4 will determine where it should go. They made the right choice because the church is still here. The problem is, where is the follow-up? Is the follow-up now able to take the church to the other step? I am not going to pass an opinion on it, but we may have made some mistakes, some missteps along the way.
Okay, I now ask Angela Brandon to ask your question.
I want to say that I have to agree with Mr. Marx that the church will always be here. Marx himself said that religion is the opium of the oppressed, and right now the world is very oppressed. So whether we like it or not, I think that we are heading backwards to something called spirituality. People are going to head back to something that brings them comfort because they can't find it in the material world right now. So that is going to happen. Also, I would say that the only reason the church is interpreted as being an oppressor is because we have not, through the education system, brought our children up to speed with regard to their history, the reality in which they live, who they were before they come here, and the reality of the international world itself. Because I have gone to church for many, many, many years, and I realized that that did not impact on me in terms of being enslaved. It was something to do with spirituality at some level. What I find is, now that I have gone to other places, that the church, the preachers do not themselves, as Mr. Mark said, interpret the Bible in a way that young people can understand what is really being said and what they should take from it. And so my question is, what does spirituality have to do with anything in this world? Can anybody answer?
Let me jump in very quickly.
I can answer. They got other panelists that they can answer that. I could answer, but let other people answer that, bro.
Well, I will leave that question to you, but I just want to make a point that so far my own research is suggesting that it's not that people are not going to church. They are going. They're just going to somebody else's church. Many of them will tell you they're former Anglicans. Real thing.
I've heard the facts. That does not tell you the facts at all. What you will find is that some of our young people, when they're very young, they leave the Anglican church. When they come back more mature, and a lot of them say that they left. They come back because they want to be fed. So the
topic is church, not Anglican church. The topic is church, not Anglican church. It did not say Anglican church and reparation. It said church.
Exactly.
Well, let's bring it back to the topic of reparations, because it is difficult for somebody to help you if you're not prepared to help yourself. Now, if, as you raised the point, Reverend Morris, that the Methodists couldn't help, the Moravians couldn't help, The Quakers certainly couldn't help. Nobody could help. The only people that can help our society, our community, our people on the way up, on the way to emancipation from mental slavery is ourselves, nobody else. We have to take a look at who we are, how we do things. We have to take a look at what we've inherited, how much of it is relevant to who we are, how much of it is relevant to today's generation. Otherwise, we are going to be on a slippery slope, and the numbers already suggest this. So
Okay,
I'm saying
sorry.
that we have to be prepared to help ourselves. Yes, there is a debt to be paid in terms of all the things you mentioned, in terms of, I like the idea of sport, in terms of education, etc. All that is helpful, but none of that means anything to anybody who cannot and are not prepared to help themselves.
Okay, Alfred, you did say you didn't have the statistics, but I will ask the question. Are the numbers in church falling, or are we saying the numbers in the Anglican church are falling? As the lady said, I think Angela said, the topic is the church.
Mm-hmm.
And at no time in terms of positing the discussion did I mention the Anglican church. And at the start, I said the church was involved in slavery. So we have, because it is set in an Anglican church and we have Anglican priests here, the situation, it is the church. So I'm asking, we have spoken about the Anglican church not being around in another 20 or 30 years, but is the church growing? Because I am of the view that if the church is growing, maybe the Anglican church would have to catch up. But if we are having growing numbers in the church, I think that is positive.
Well, the statistics suggest that there is from say the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way coming up, there is a decline in claimed Anglican church membership. There is a similar increase in Pentecostal church membership. There's a solid block of what I call the evangelicals. The Seventh-day Adventists are growing fast, and others. And then there's another steady block, consistent from the 60s till now, where people who claim no religion at all. Now, I suspect that they don't claim to belong to any particular faith tradition. However, I believe, and I'm going to do some investigation on this as part of my studies, that they have their own sense of spirituality, which they feel perhaps is compromised by their engaging with a particular faith tradition.
But Alfred, you're not putting forward the facts. You are saying that the Seventh-day Adventists are growing. This body is growing. What are the numbers? I have to think as an historian. What are the facts?
The next
Where
time
are the numbers?
The
Tell me
next
by
time
how many?
I will bring the numbers.
All right. We are at the point where we said we are not sure of the numbers. And I would have seen, I think it was the 2010 census, because this would have come up before with regard to the Anglican church. But it said, this isn't something that I would have thought of actually bringing that tonight. As persons are saying, we are looking at the church, reparatory justice, and the healing process. In our final moments, unless there are other questions, I would like the panel, in terms of wrapping up, to let us look at where we are and where we need to go with regard to the church and the healing process.
Is it possible to make one contribution?
Yes, as I said, I didn't see a question, although is this Mark?
My name
just
is
hold
Marcia.
1 second.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, just hold 1 second, because I've seen a comment in the, sorry, I should not be laughing. All right, Marcia, can you go with your comment because I see a comment, but I'm not pulling it up at the moment.
Yes,
Marcy,
good
can
night.
you make your
Yes,
comment?
good night. Good night to the panelists, and good morning to Charles Morris and whoever else is overseas. I first of all would like to thank Alfred Taylor for again bringing historical context and truth to the matter of the role of the Anglican Church, aka the Church of England, the Methodists and the Moravians during the period of the 1600s up to 1834 and even beyond. I joined this Zoom meeting because I understood it was a conversations about the church, reparatory justice, and the healing process. I came in when Joy was speaking, and I therefore lost a lot of the context of what she was saying. However, I'd just like to contribute that from my historical readings of all of those churches, the Church of England would have obviously played the strongest role during the period of colonization and the development of the sugar and slave industry and the enslavement of individuals in Africa and the continual generational enslavement of persons born on the island who were then listed as Barbadians, who were the majority of the 82,000 plus persons enslaved at 1834. During that 200-year period, the Church of England enslaved persons in Barbados on the Codrington estates, and those numbers were in excess of 300, almost 400 people at 1834, and received 3,000 to 4,000, if I remember correctly from my analysis of the data available online, 3,000 to 4,000 pounds, which I'm sure Alfred Taylor can tell you all, equates in today's money to a couple $1 million. Therefore, the Church of England, in accepting its role in the enslavement of individuals in Barbados on the Codrington estates, has to address reparations within the context of what is required in today's Barbados and in today's world. And there's no denying their role. The role of the Moravian and Methodists, from what I have read, were to come in. They were allowed to come in, and they were allowed to go on lands of plantations and to encourage Christianity in only a certain context. All of those churches took particular parts of the Bible and delivered to enslaved people, and those parts spoke of continued subservience to one's master, and one's master had the image of one's God, and all of those were Eurocentric images. Those images continue to perpetuate in the churches across the island of Barbados and other places in the Caribbean and other places colonized by the Church of England. The Moravian and Methodists, during the period of coming into the late 1700s and 1800s, delivered a similar message, but they saw that they should perhaps try to encourage into their congregation persons known as colored or mulatto who were free, because they wanted to capture those people, as opposed to, they had no way of capturing the white congregation of the Church of England. And they focused on those people. The message was the same. So even if they didn't own as much as the Church of England with regards to property in Barbados and regards to enslaved people, those other churches also need to address reparatory justice.
Everything.
Now, we always talk about all of this in the context of the church, and we don't speak of the state, but they operated as one. And most of those priests in the Church of England were second and third sons of wealthy people in England and wealthy plantation owners by 1834 of Barbados, whose second and third sons had their interests at heart, their parents' interests at heart in preserving the plantation system. Online is information about the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. That data is online. All of the schools set up between 1825 and well into 1830s and 40s were for whites only. A few persons who were called colored and a few enslaved people, in some cases 3 and 4 in a parish, were allowed some schooling, and that schooling was biblical teaching from the Bible's select, and in the document of the society speaks of the selection that must be made from the Bible and delivered in these so-called schools to a few enslaved children and a few free Black and free colored and free mulatto children, and the bulk of those persons educated by the Church of England and by the Methodists and by the Moravians were poor white children. So I think that Alfred Taylor has contributed to the history of Barbados and the history of churches, and he has removed some of the veil that has been over the eyes of people in this island, including, I should hope, some of the priests who are listening in, who well know this history, but don't talk about it. And reparatory justice is required, and it is required from the Church of England in some form or format. We are not only saying the Church of England, all of those churches in those years played a role in ensuring that enslaved people had one vision, and that vision was subservience to one's master, subservience to one's God, fear of God. And let us also remember that Jesus Christ is said to have been a Jew. And Christianity needs to examine that in the context of 2021 and in the context of the compilation, should I say, the compiling of what the Europeans produce as the Bible and what you all who are practicing Christianity use in your services. Jesus Christ was a Jew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nurse. I will now ask the panelists to give a wrap-up statement in terms of the way forward, and I will have the order in reverse order. So I will start with you, Charles, and go in that order. So it'd be Charles, Joy, Alfred, and the Dean. Over to you, Charles. 2 minutes.
I have argued that the church, and I've argued about not only the Anglican Church, but all them involved in slavery. To come and tell me tonight that this person catered for white churches and colored churches, there may have been some of these persons in these churches, but we had white Moravians, white Anglicans, white Methodists, white Baptists, all coming to enslave and in fact took part in the enslavement of our people. At the same time, I am convinced more, in fact, maybe more than any person else, that there is need for reparation. I have stated my need, what my reparation would look like. As a matter of fact, I even feel right now that in terms of education, that church in England, universities in England should make a substantial contribution to the University of the West Indies, and I'll tell you why. We are having a lot of diseases now, non-communicable diseases, that can be related to slavery, that can be related to the diets. I believe, in fact, when you look at some other Black persons living through the world, they may have the same problems as us, but they get solved by the medication. What happened that the Black people in the Caribbean and in the Americas are still suffering from diabetes, from hypertension, from all of these things, and that one word is slavery. So I believe that the substantial amount of, as a matter of fact, research, they should pay for research into these areas. I believe that. But I also believe that we as Black people have a responsibility to ourselves as well. And that is, one, we must pass on our story. We're not telling people our story. We should tell our story in such a way as the same Jews told the story to their people. Never again shall this thing happen to us. We're not telling our people that. We are continuing to play victimhood. Our ancestors never played victim. That's why they never allowed themselves to be defined by slavery. Slavery happened to them. They never allowed themselves to be defined by slavery. In addition, I noticed that last year, everybody jumped onto the bandwagon. Black history in the Caribbean should never be defined by Black history in the United States. Should never be. And don't tell me again that we have to wait until somebody else do it. Sounds came out of the enslaved people. Michael Royal brought ashore. They all look to freedom. And as a matter of fact, if we want to solve our problem in the church, we have to create our own Caribbean theology. We have people like Courtwright Davis. We have people like Monwell Williams. And there is no, at Cudgeon College, we are, in fact, Cudgeon College is another story that I would want to deal with another time. But we have people like, we have no theologian that is being studied at Cudgeon College, no Caribbean theologian. 1, 2, we missed the boat when we allowed some of our brightest persons to leave the Caribbean, and Barbados in particular. People like Stephen Fields, Cleon got it, Morel left for a time. We took away, allowed them to go. And right now, I must confess, I am appalled at what I am seeing coming out of Cudgeon College. They cannot interpret the scriptures to the people. That is our basic problem. When we do that, we can preach a Black Jesus and Jesus from a Black experience. I have all the time for the Christology, the Athanasian Creed. I have time for the Homoousin, the Homoousin. I have time for all of those. But at the same time, I must have a Black theology that speaks to my own experiences, that speaks to me, as Marcia Iris said, that speaks to me as a Black man. And we cannot do that if we do not employ our Black theologians in the Caribbean.
Excuse me, Charles Morris. I didn't say anything about.
Please, Miss Nurse, please. Please.
Don't get...
Reverend Charles, I am going to ask you to withdraw the statement you just made about the persons coming out of Cudgeon College cannot interpret. I do not think that as an esteemed institution.
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way.
Let me withdraw that comment being made.
Let me withdraw that and put it this way. I am baffled by some of the theology.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you. Could we go on to Joy Workman?
Unlike the other speakers, I could be classified as an atheist, definitely not a believer. But what I do appreciate is whatever I believe or don't believe, the church plays a role in people's lives. It gives meaning to people's lives. People look for it for guidance. People go to it for refuge. People go to it for spirituality. And in that light, whether the church as an institution, like everything else in the world, is going to see dynamic changes. The Anglican Church is recognizing it's under threat in terms of how it operates. How do it attract numbers? And that has been part of the discussion between the two clergy. For me, to make when Michael sent me the brief about the nature of these conversations, it was about making the church relevant. My question is, and I'm only questioning because I can't make concrete statements. I can, but in this forum, I wouldn't. My question is, when the clergy, as in an esteemed person like Charles Morris, try to be defensive about a church as opposed to the church or churches, what is the relevance in healing? And if healing is caused by a number of factors, I stress the economic disunity, the economic injustices. Shelley spoke very eloquently about a whole series of things that speaks to justice. My little understanding of the Christian church is guided by the teachings of a Jesus. I don't know, whatever it is for you all, but one of the things that I pick out of that is goodness. And if healing is, if the church is going to practice by its main teacher, who is Jesus, how is the church goodness going to be continued so that it could be relevant? And if relevance is not addressed and numbers and stuff is like the main thing, or rather the church, a new interpretation is irrelevant, maybe Codrington is leading the way because it recognizes that it needs, this maybe, you know? So my thing is, if the church is continue to be relevant, and relevance is very much concerned with healing, and as Angela was asking, she feels the church will be here because people need spirituality. If the church can deliver that message, relevance, goodness, and justice. Justice. The little stories I know of that is here on the radio or so and so, or somebody tell me, it's always about justice. Unfortunately, too many things in the church, about the church, with the church, is not about justice. There's nothing anybody can tell me, Joy Workman, that can make me a Christian today. Because within the churches that is supposed to practice Christianity, justice is not the overriding factor.
Thank you. Major Taylor.
Yes, please. One, the historical facts speak for themselves. The church in its history did bad stuff, all of them. Two, soft power. The hegemonic discourse has had its effect. It continues to have its effect. Worked out in the liturgy and the language to a point where even the most learned of us don't always recognize the process ongoing. However, we must have the agency and the conviction to examine the process for ourselves. We must have the courage to discard what does not serve us as a people well. We must have the courage to make it look and feel like us. And this applies equally to any kind of religious faith tradition, whether it's Anglican, Pentecostal, evangelical, as what I am beginning to observe is something that I've labeled very loosely religious imperialism coming out of the United States of America, which is every bit as dangerous as anything else we've described tonight. We have to have the courage to examine these things and discard what does not serve us themselves. I would like my church to look and feel like my people. In Australia, they've called themselves the Church of Australia, no longer the Church of England in Australia. Likewise, the United Church of Canada, the Episcopal Church in America. The only people that still retain the name province of whatever church in the whatever area are former colonies. That says hegemony is still enforced.
Thank you. Dean Shelley, and
Thank you. And again, thanks to my fellow presenters. I think for me, we can talk about these things where they met our particular countries or our particular nation states and do the history of our nation states and the intersections. For me, we must recognize that this goes way back beyond British colonial slavery. There are a set of attitudes, ideas, ways of being, ways of thinking that emerged in human history, period, before British colonial slavery, upon which British colonial slavery was built and strengthened and used new technology and new ways to enforce. But at the core, the business of imperialism, the business of attitudes of supremacy and dominance are what the issue is at the core. And those are the things that need to be addressed. So to Patrick's question, resources for alternative ways and advocating for engaging in those kinds of things, those are the things I'm talking about. So the industrial schooling that has happened all across the Commonwealth and all across places where the Industrial Revolution hit as a byproduct of the process of colonization, that has to be turned on its head, because we literally have to teach people how to think and how to see themselves and others from a different point of view. That work has to happen, because wherever there are attitudes of dominance and supremacy, whether it be by race, whether it be by economics, whether it be by class, it does not matter. Once it is an attitude and a practice of dominance and supremacy, the same things that slaves experience, the same things that any oppressed peoples experience, they will continue to experience, whether the people doing it are white or some other race or of some other origin. Our brothers and sisters in Haiti are testimony to that. Haiti set the example for us as a Caribbean about what it looked like to fight. As a Trinidadian, we didn't have to fight for nothing. I mean, our independence was handed to us, right? And as a nation state that is very diverse and full of all kinds of faith traditions, Islam, Hinduism, across the board, yes? So Christianity still holds the 63% that it holds. But what's the marker for us? And this is how I know it is those underneath things that need to be addressed. The numbers of unaffiliated people continue to rise every year. Yes, so there's a decline in Christianity in all of its denominations and a decline in Islam, a decline because the number of unaffiliated people continue to grow, because more and more people are rejecting that which is dressed up and touted to be justice that is not. And I will join Joy in that understanding and in that perspective. And so we have to address the underlying matters that will and reteach and reorient to a different way and a different understanding of humanity and human relating and human organizing of societies, etc. Because once we're organizing ourselves in the same ways that emerged in the 4th century, which is where we are, we just keep regurgitating, what was happening in the 4th century and beyond. And we get trapped and caught in the pitfalls, and we keep othering each other and getting off the actual discourse that needs to happen. And when we engage there, when we create programs and curricula that are about peacemaking, that are about what justice is really about, giving each human being and seeing each human being as made in the image of God, as having worth, that there is no group by any definition or distinction that is more superior than another, and that domination of any kind is not okay, then we will begin to see some change. And that is the work of repair that needs to happen. It's repairing of psyches. It's the healing of minds and hearts. It's the healing of ways and understandings of relating that needs to happen. And so I really value, for example, the Ubuntu understandings that are part of the African diaspora, right? Because that's a whole different way of seeing, relating, engaging, and organizing society. And that is what this demands. Yeah, we can't keep just changing out characters and shuffling things around the board. It requires a complete overhaul. Yes, because we entered into already stratified realities, and that those things just got reinforced generation after generation after generation after generation. And we have to stop, dismantle, turn it upside down, and go again. So on some level, I agree with my brother Alfred on this point. The church we inherited, which is the church of the empire, will die its natural death. Because the empire, in its systems and processes, used things that were unjust to get to where it was. Those things must die. But the church of Christ, which we inherited, will never die. Because the church of Christ, in all of its varying forms, Anglican being one, the church of Christ will live on. Because that, for us as Christians, is the alternative. And we are called to align ourselves to that, for as hard as it is, and for as long as it takes, because that will never die. And so I think that's the work for me, that we must commit ourselves to mobilize resources around and engage in systematically and consistently over time, because it will take a couple generations for the shift and transformation to take root and become the new normal.
Thank you, Dean Shelley. And before I ask Annette Weeks to do the summary and vote of thanks, I know that Sadie Goddard, I'm not sure she had a question or was informing me that person's hands were up. So I'll just go to Sadie Goddard because I think Dean Shelley answered Patrick's question. So Sadie, if you have a question or comment, please do that. Then I will ask Annette Weeks to do the vote of thanks and the summary.
Good night, everyone. Thanks, Mr. Brown. I just wanted to quickly add in from a social psychological perspective. I would have conducted research with primarily Black middle-class Barbadians and about the difficulties that they experience and how they deal with it. And the thing that came across very strongly were two beliefs that were grounded in their Christian, their understanding of Christianity. One was that life is about difficulty. And the second was that, you know, there are things that we can do individually and as a community to deal with difficulties, but ultimately we're to put things in God's hands and look to be ready for him to deliver us. And my concern with that as a Christian social psychologist, if I may, is that while that particular belief stemming from their Christian, you know, their understanding of Christianity helps people to cope with things that are out of their control, it also obscures, as some persons have talked about, the ways in which colonialism and now neo-colonialism and neoliberalism, in, you know, being now pirated by international development agencies, are shaping our realities as Black persons in the global South. And so I agree really strongly with Ms. Wortman's point, you know, that the Anglican Church needs to accept its responsibility and its power in shaping the narratives that we have about the living conditions that we are experiencing. The beliefs that so that it is not just about you know, God, life being about difficulties and you know, God delivering us from those things, but also the Anglican Church has a responsibility, a moral responsibility, if we're talking about being just and being good and those kinds of things, to call out the ways in which those policies and programs now being touted, being in place by international development agencies to create structural barriers for us in Barbados, across the region and the diaspora, you know, and so I think I agree with the point about the financial aspect of reparatory justice, but I think as well, you know, I was made to understand through my work that the Anglican Church, through the Christian Council, is a you know, provides a Christian understanding in all the policies and decisions that are made in Barbados. That is a powerful position that we have. And therefore, I know that some of the work that we have done through the Social Justice Committee that was helpful in shaping my own career trajectory and where I've gone, there is some of it going. So there's some of that work that is happening that we're doing. So I'm not here to say that we're not doing it, but understanding the narratives that through our teachings and that Marcia Nurse talked about, kind of, you know, the messaging that came through in the teachings and the understandings and the interpretations of the scriptures that are given to us, and Alfred, you talked about that as well. If we accept that those beliefs are being shaped by the way in which the Anglican Church teaches the scriptures and our understanding about ourselves and our place in the world, we have to accept as well that we need to shape the narrative about how these structural injustices are playing out in the lives of certainly Black Barbadians, and what in helping persons to really collectively mobilize to stand up against those things. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sadie.
So, Mr. Brown, if you just give me 1 minute to respond to Sadie.
Okay.
And Sadie, I absolutely agree with you. And a lot of what you said are examples of what needs to be redeemed and transformed. The narrative does need to change. And the narrative that we have and we have is the narrative that we have been handed. Unless we are doing our own work. And that is the responsibility of the church, the church's leaders. yes, but it's not our responsibility alone. We do it together. But we need to, we have to be willing and have the courage to push, to say, this is what we were handed, but this is not the only voice. There
For
are
sure.
other ways of seeing, there are other ways of understanding, and to make space and hold space as people come to that as well, because it's not going to happen overnight.
Most definitely.
You know, so I'm agreeing with you, and I'm saying that the work is deep and long,
Yes.
but it will only happen if we actually engage it consistently and not conveniently.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, ladies. Not wanting to open up another discussion, but I think that lends into Alfred Taylor's comment about church looking like us. I will now invite Annette Weeks to give the vote of thanks in summary, and if she would care to tell us what we're going to be doing in August. Over to you, Annette.
Thank you very much, Moderator Brown. Good night, everyone. We've had an extremely rich, diverse, and some very profound comments this evening. And Reverend Shelley Ann, I'll start with yourself, but you noted that bygone justice was largely based on divine rights of emperors who thrived on inequality and the system that was legal but not necessarily just. You noted that the church has a leadership role of leading us into an alternative reality. And certainly you introduced the acronym of ACT, ACT, namely accountability that is consistent and advocacy. Consciousness raising and conversion was the C, and the T was transformation and truth telling. You noted that the relationship of the church and with the church has been long, complicated, and deep. Major Alfred started by, well, he didn't start, but he certainly quoted that no colonization or no colonizing venture was complete without a pious minister. He indicated that the rules of operation of conduct in the Anglican Church don't necessarily reflect who I am or made him feel that I am at home, referring to himself. And then he talked about reparation by acknowledging for himself the 4 R's, namely regret, restore, repetition, and remedial practice. Sister Joy, we were happy to have you, and you spoke about basically the crabs in the barrel analysis and being drowned in exploitation. She also spoke about the persistent discriminatory practices in terms of the distribution of resources, and that there's a need for the church to remain relevant in today's society, and that is a theme she repeated on more than one occasion. She spoke in passing about the CARICOM 10-point plan, but she also spoke about the economic justice and that the church is very silent on that. She therefore concluded by saying that by its silence, the church has become complicit. And Reverend Charles, you indicated that based on the previous comments that you had heard from the 3 other panelists, well, you were very provocative when he says, why don't we shut the Anglican Church and call it a day? I'm sure you're just very tongue-in-cheek with respect to that. But you made an interesting point that we're saying nothing about a parliament when we celebrated 350 years. Yet it was only in the last 50 years of those 50 of those years were Black people allowed in the said parliament. You support reparation and the examination of the issue of reparations, but not revenge. And reminded us that the Anglican Church was just one of the churches involved in the slave trade. But you know that we cannot have reparation and repentance unless you have role reversal. I've also noted, by the way, that everyone pretty well agrees that there's need for reparation. And some of the things they mentioned that should be the cancellation of debts, removal from blacklists, support perhaps of sporting organizations or any organizations that will uplift our country, and investment certainly, and hope to remove the burden of international corporation taxes. So we've had quite a cross-section of views. We had some research to back it up and some quotations to support those views. We've been educated in some cases and further educated in other cases. It is evident that empirical evidence is available, because at the end of the day, it would seem that education and re-education will be the key for all of us. So, family and friends of Holy Trinity, thank you for joining us in the Trinity Chapel as we once again presented Conversations. Tonight, our conversation was entitled The Church, Reparatory Justice and the Healing Process. First, let me say thank you to the Reverend Dr. Sonia Hines, who was supposed to join us. I didn't hear her, but we were hoping that she would join us and give us the opening prayer. That unfortunately did not take place, but our thoughts and prayers go to her wherever she is. I say definitely a big thank you to our esteemed panel who so ably and capably addressed this often sidestepped, whispered, or even silenced topic. Our panelists tonight were the Very Reverend Dr. Shelley Ann Itenya, the first female dean appointed in the Anglican Church in Trinidad and Tobago, and who is the Dean and Rector of the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity. Sister Joy Workman, our concerned citizen, Pan-Africanist, feminist, and a fashion designer by profession. Thank you for joining us. Major Alfred Taylor, former Director of Music of the Barbados Defense Force Band, and currently Deputy Director of the Barbados National Youth Symphony Orchestra, and Information Technology Specialist who is currently pursuing postgraduate studies. We wish to thank the Reverend Charles Morris, ordained priest in the Anglican Church, former history teacher and currently serving as Deputy High Commissioner for Barbados in the United Kingdom. Thank you all for readily agreeing to join us across the various social media platforms which are hosted by the Church of the Holy Trinity. Thank you for your comments, insights, and willingness to share your thoughts on this topic that some would prefer it continued to be kept silent. Let me thank our technical team for once again staying the course. Without them, these monthly conversations and other digital events that take place would not be possible. They are always behind the scenes, but not behind in anything else. Panelists, especially invited guests, all of you who have once again joined us as a family and friends of the Church of the Holy Trinity. I would like to say that we are most grateful to you for being with us tonight and providing your inputs. It has been our distinct pleasure to bring to you this conversation entitled The Church, Reparatory Justice and the Healing Process. Thank you and have a very blessed night. I invite you as well to join us once again on the first Tuesday of August for another Conversations. Moderator.
Thank you too, because
Thank you.
before you all know it, you are actually being part of the community now by bringing these topics to people. So the church is not behind anymore. We are catching up. Are we? Let's applaud ourselves. Let's applaud ourselves. Because you are dealing with the issues. So by you are dealing with the issues. So we thank you here in the community too.
Currently the Church of the Holy Trinity is celebrating its 190th anniversary, and we'll now have an update on the activities that are upcoming. I will ask Sandra Brown to present these upcoming activities.
Okay, thank you, Michael. As I said, the Church of the Holy Trinity has been celebrating 190 years of ministry in this parish. To this end, we have been engaging in activities based on our theme, Reflect, Renew, Rejoice. We will host a fundraising event, the Best Chef Rev Cook-Off, on the church grounds on Saturday, July 24th at 6 p.m. Clergy from across the diocese will vie for the coveted title of Best Chef Rev. Tickets are $40 each for those attending in person, and they can be purchased from the committee members. For the $40, you will receive a meal, a complimentary drink, entertainment, and you will watch the cook-off. For those who want to view the main event, the cook-off online, we are asking you to make a donation of $20 Barbados dollars or $10 US, which you can make through ticketpalcaribbean.com. If you want to donate more, we will accept it. Upon paying, you will receive the link to access the event. The weekend of July 30th and 31st, the committee will present Shalosh, the spiritual journey. We will focus on the theme, Reflect, Renew, Rejoice. The journey begins Friday, July 30th at 7 p.m. That will be a time of reflection. Saturday morning at 8 will be a time of renewal with a prayer breakfast. Only 50 applicants will be permitted for the sessions on Friday night and Saturday morning. However, all are invited to the Praise-a-thon on Saturday evening, July 31st at 6 p.m. for a time of rejoicing. Then in August, we will have a session entitled Get Up and Move. Although we will have activities each month until November, in November, our activities will climax with a gala on Saturday, November 20th. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And before we have the closing prayer, I must say that the Conversations Committee is made up of 3 persons: Annette Weeks, Michael Brown, and Lana Fingal. Lana Fingal has decided to be absent tonight because she's persuaded her husband to take her out for celebrating their 25th anniversary of marriage. So in my best voice when I was in the choir, I will sing Lead Us, Heavenly Father, Lead Us, or some other appropriate song for them. But let us wish Lana a splendid remainder of the evening as she celebrates her 25th wedding anniversary with her husband, Richard. Congratulations to Lana and Richard. We will now have the closing prayer by Imelda Brown.
Almighty God, we thank you for allowing us to have this discussion this evening. It reminds us of the tasks that your disciple Paul would have encountered as he was sent to the Gentiles. I'm sure that many of the issues he probably would have encountered. And so, as we say goodbye to this session, for this reason, we bow our knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, and that Christ may dwell in our hearts through faith, that we, being rooted and grounded in love, may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And now to him who by the power at work within us is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
Okay, thank you, Sandra and Imelda. Sandra for the update and Imelda for the closing prayer. I would also like to thank the technical team who tonight has gone well past overtime, and they can send their invoice to the treasurer of the PCC. I'm sure it'll be approved. Once again, thank all of you for staying with us at this time. I hope that you've been challenged and have also been rethinking some of the positions that you've had. Again, thank you very much. Do get home safely. And for those like me who have been without electricity since Friday, I'm sure that Light and Power has sorted us out this evening. Thank you very much for staying with us. Thank you.
I'll take that as permission to sign off. Good night.
Yes,
Good night, Alfred.
Take care, my dear. Good to see you.
we've gone long past our usual hour, so I think our technical team would not allow us our usual chit chat because they're
We have a lot to talk about.
Good night, everyone, and
Good
thank you.
night. Take care.
Blessings.
Thank you,
Charles,
Reverend.
are you